It's a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon Professor Andre Beteille, a Professor of Sociology at the University of Delhi and author of a number of distinguished works on Indian society and on general problems of human society. Andre, I'd like to ask you first something about your background and upbringing. Tell us something about your childhood and family background.
Well, probably from the point of view of anthropology, the most important part of my background is that I was born in India and I grew up in India as the offspring of a mixed marriage. My mother was Indian, Bengali, and my father was French. Now, he was born in India himself, but he was French-speaking and born of French parents in India, and I grew up with a rather uncertain position between these two cultures. And well, I had sort of middle-class education that many people who later became professionals would have had. I was sent to a boarding school where I was taught English, and although the language I learnt and used at home as a child was neither French nor English but Bengali, but I was sent off to boarding school where I was taught to speak English, and then went to college as an undergraduate in Calcutta. Actually, I'd started as a student of physics, and after some time gave that up and took up anthropology. And initially I wasn't at all sure as to what I wanted to become, whether a social anthropologist or an archaeologist or a physical anthropologist, but gradually I moved into social anthropology and began teaching in the Department of Sociology in the University of Delhi, so that although I work with anthropologists and I am regarded by many as an anthropologist, I actually work in a Department of Sociology in the University of Delhi.
What first attracted you to read social anthropology? Why were you interested in it?
Well, I suppose I had a kind of natural inclination, if you can call it that, towards trying to compare and understand the ways of life of various kinds of people, because I could see that there was such a contrast between the background from which my mother came and the one from which my father came, and that sort of created in me an interest in the diversity of human cultures and ways of life, and that I think was a very important factor in my orientation towards anthropology and the comparative study of human societies.
Did you go on to do a postdoctoral or a postgraduate degree in anthropology?
Well, I did an honours degree in anthropology from the University of Calcutta, and after that an MSc in anthropology. The MSc is a sort of taught degree, and you take courses for 2 years and then take exams at the end of it, and you get an MSc degree. It's not a research degree. Shortly after that, a new department of sociology was opened in the University of Delhi, which was then emerging as probably the premier university in the country, and I moved to the University of Delhi as a lecturer in sociology. So I started teaching sociology, and then I began my research for my PhD degree, and I was fortunate that this new department was headed by a very, very distinguished and a very remarkable person, the anthropologist Srinivas, and I worked with him for my PhD, and I did this while I was teaching sociology in the University of Delhi.
We'll probably talk about various people later on, but since you've mentioned M.N. Srinivas, was he what sort of man was he, and what sort of influence do you think he had on your own work?
Oh, I think he influenced my work very greatly, but there was another influence on my work, a man whom I had got to know in Calcutta, who was also an anthropologist and had been involved in the nationalist movement. This was a man called N.K. Bose. But in my professional training as an anthropologist, I think the influence of Srinivas was very great. I think Srinivas was in many ways a very remarkable person. He had a very sensitive mind. He was very persuasive in conversation. He was not a great lecturer, and he wrote well, but I don't think that he had a great mind for formal theory. But he could convey to you a sense of the richness and the variety of any kind of social situation, the inherent richness and complexity in any kind of social situation. And he used to say that, you know, social life is untidy. It's very untidy, and you mustn't try to tidy it up too much. And I think that is very important. And I as a sociologist, I'm inherently suspicious of theorists who try to make social reality appear more coherent than one normally experiences it being.
Was it Srinivas who made you particularly interested in caste, or was that?
No, I don't think Srinivas had a line in that sense. If he had a line, it was Fieldwork. He insisted that in order to understand society, you must go out and live with people and see what they're doing. And this was a great departure in India, not only in social theory in general, but in India, which has had a very long intellectual tradition, but an intellectual tradition which has paid very little attention to observation and description. It's an intellectual tradition which has had a pronounced preoccupation with formal theory. And Srinivas sort of conveyed in all of us the importance of going out and seeing what was actually happening there. And he always argued that there is a book view of society and a field view of society, and the two are not the same. And you must learn this, and there's no way in which you can learn this just from books. You go out into the villages, you go and live in a village or live with a community, and you will realize that the way it works is very different from the way in which it is supposed to work. And I think that is very important.
Was it he who suggested that you went to Tanjore, or how did you come to choose
More
that?
or less. He was very, in many ways, he was very permissive. I mean, he didn't insist on, at least with me, he didn't insist that I should do this particular thing or that particular thing. I think there was an idea at first that I would work with Tamil speakers in Delhi. And again, this was rather unusual, because in India, most people who made empirical studies studied people in their own community or in their own linguistic region. And Srinivas, you must remember, had been trained in Oxford by Radcliffe Brown, and he had a great admiration for Evans Pritchard. And Srinivas insisted that I should work in an area which was very different from the one in which I had grown up. And this was very unusual for social studies in India. So he said, well, I'm Bengali speaking. I came from West Bengal in eastern India. He said, you must choose some other community. You must learn a new language. You must come to terms with a different way of life from the one in which you have grown up. And at first there was an idea that I might study Tamil speakers in Delhi, a neighborhood consisting of Tamil speakers in Delhi. But I thought that would be rather dull, and I went off to Tanjore. I think the choice of Tanjore was mainly my own idea, and at that time I was excited by the possibility of studying this part of India, which had a very rich religious tradition, which had ancient temples, you know, the kind of thing that Chris Fuller finally did. That was more the kind of thing I thought I would do when I was going out to Tanjore, but it turned out actually very differently.
So you were intended to study religion and ritual and matters such as that?
Well, not religion as such, temples. And I thought that in getting to understand the way in which a temple worked, I would look at many things besides religion. I thought that I would look at politics. I thought that I would look at economics, and not just religion and ritual. No, I don't think that was ever my primary interest.
When you arrived in the village, coming from an entirely different part of India, do you recall your first impressions, your first surprises, or?
Yes, very vividly, very vividly. I was struck as much by the differences as by the similarities, and both were in many ways unexpected. Now, this is an area in which a very different language is spoken from the ones which I had spoken either Bengali, which was my native language, or Hindi, which is the language spoken in Delhi, where I had already started working in the University of Delhi. Tamil is a totally different language. I'd learnt a bit of Tamil before coming out. And what struck me, I was living with a group of Brahmins, and they had an elaborate ritual vocabulary, much of which was highly Sanskritized. And of course, Bengali is the most Sanskritized among Indian languages. So I not only surprised myself, but I also surprised the people with whom I lived by sort of my natural understanding of their ritual vocabulary, much of which was in Sanskrit. And Sanskritized Bengali was not all that different from the. So that was one thing. The other thing was, of course, my mother's family were very orthodox Brahmins until my mother's generation, and my maternal grandmother lived in many ways the life of a Brahmin widow. And the kind of life which has disappeared more or less from the cities now in Bengal. And for instance, she would not wear shoes. She would go every morning to bathe in the river. My childhood was in Chandanagar, which was a French enclave about 20 miles north of Calcutta, and she would go every morning to bathe, and she would come back in her wet clothes. And I'd forgotten all this, or thought that I'd put all this behind me. But when I went to live in this village, what, about 20 years afterwards, I would see these Sri Vaishnava Brahmin widows coming back from their morning bath in the river Kaveri, and this immediately brought back to me such an important part of my childhood. So I was certainly discovering myself while I was doing my fieldwork, and also discovering many things which were very different from what I'd expected them to be.
Such as?
Oh, such as, for instance, the relations between castes were much more rigid and formal than anything that I had experienced in the city of Calcutta or in the city of Delhi. For instance, the attention which these Brahmins paid to matters of detail, not only in their religious life, but in their ordinary everyday customs, like the way they ate their food, the kind of food they ate, the way they served their food, their dress, and so on and so forth. All this struck me as such an elaborate and formalized world, which was very, very different from the very fluid and amorphous world of the city of Calcutta, where I had grown up and where I had gone to school and gone to college. It was very, very different, yes.
Did many anthropologists find their first fieldwork particularly rather difficult through loneliness or sickness or loss of privacy or whatever? Did you find it a difficult experience?
Yes. Loss of privacy was something which worried me very much, and that again is something worth noting, because after all, one might say that an English or an American anthropologist might be worried by loss of privacy while doing fieldwork in an African tribe or an Indian village. But why should an Indian be worried about that? But the point is that I was, and I'm sure that there would be very many Indians in my position who would be worried by the loss of privacy there. And there's one incident which remains in my memory, which struck me very much at that point of time, which has to do with loss of privacy. I was I'd rented the room upstairs in a house which was owned by an elderly Brahmin couple, and it was actually a single room, a large room, a single room with a veranda in front and a terrace at the back. And I had a small camp bed, and I greatly looked forward to an hour in the afternoon when I could go and sleep there, because it was quite hot, and I used to do that. And soon I found that there was a young man in the village who didn't have much to do. He would come with his mat, unroll the mat just below my camp bed, and go to sleep. And I found this profoundly disturbing. So I took my problem to my patron in the village, who was a college-educated Brahmin landowner. I took my problem to him, and I said, "Look, I'm sorry, I have a small problem." He would ask me this every time we met. "Are you all right? Are you comfortable? Do you have any problems?" And I said, well, I have a small problem. And he said, oh, you must tell me, what is it? And I said, it's this man Vardhan. He said, oh, I know this fellow. Is he troubling you? And I said, well, not really, but, I feel a bit. He said, well, what does he do? Is he been asking you for money? I said, no. What actually does he do? I said, well, in the afternoon I like to rest. And he said, well, he comes and badgers you. Well, I couldn't say that he did that, because he didn't. I said, well, he comes and he sleeps there, I said, he said, well, does he snore? And I couldn't say that he did, because he didn't. But then he said, then what does he do? I said, well, then he looked at me and he said, but why does it worry you? Why does it worry you? And I felt that really, he put it in such a way that it made me feel that I was in the wrong. And I think that was a very important lesson for me. But I was bothered by the lack of privacy. I can't say that I very greatly enjoy fieldwork. I certainly enjoy it in retrospect more than I possibly did while I was doing it. I'm not a great field worker. Srinivas was a superb field worker. I've had students who are very good field workers, but I'm sort of B- to B as a field worker.
Whatever your views of yourself as a field worker, you wrote a thesis about this field work, and then you wrote a very widely used book, Caste, Class and Power. Could you say what the theme of that book is and what you found in your work?
Yeah, well, the book, in fact, was my PhD thesis. I didn't spend very much time over the thesis. I made some changes and sent it off to the University of California Press, and to my surprise, they agreed to publish it. Well, basically, the book was a village study. You must remember that anthropology was changing its orientation in India. Until the 50s, most anthropologists studied tribes. It was only in the 50s that village studies began to acquire the kind of importance that they had assumed when I started doing my work. So it was to be a village study, that was clear. Now, what was I going to study in the village? Now, there had already been a few village studies published. There was F.G. Bailey's Caste and the Economic Frontier, Adrian Mayer's book on caste and kinship in central India, and then this very widely used collection by McM Marriott, edited by McM Marriott, Village India. And it struck me that all these books had a kind of framework within which they described the social structure of what was going on in the village, and their framework was a sort of morphological framework in which the basic morphological structure was the caste structure. In other words, they would give a presentation of the caste structure of the village, and within that framework discuss whatever else they considered interesting. Adrian Mayerwood wrote on kinship, Bailey wrote on economics and politics, somebody else wrote on religion, and so on. So, but I of course felt that this was a very important morphological feature of the village. It was there in the settlement pattern of the village, so you couldn't escape the caste structure. So I did that. I looked at the caste structure and the division of the village into Brahmins, non-Brahmins, untouchables, and their subdivisions, and the way in which all this was arranged in a certain pattern. But I soon realized that there was something else also in the village, which was perhaps as important, even though it didn't strike one as immediately, and that was the division of the village into landowners, tenants, and landless laborers, which I describe as the class system. And I found that there was also a certain distribution of power in the village. So I tried to describe first each of these three structures: the caste structure, the division of the village into its various castes and their arrangement, then the class system, then the power structure. And I could also see that the village was changing, a great deal was changing in the village, and I thought that, well, one might describe this change by taking up each of these systems and describing changes in them in turn, or one might try to examine the relationship between caste, class, and power and see how that relationship itself was changing. So this is basically the theme of the book. What was the nature of the relationship between caste, class, and power at the end of the 19th century towards the beginning of the 20th century? And I found that there was a great deal of correspondence between these three systems, so that the Brahmins were mainly the landowners, and they occupied the commanding heights in the distribution of power, and the non-Brahmins were the tenants, and they occupied the middle levels of power, and the untouchables were
Did you find a correspondence, an exact correspondence between the class, general dimensions of the class structure and the structure of power and class?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is really what caught my attention. Of course, there was a great deal of correspondence, but this correspondence was changing. I could see that it was changing, and I was interested in identifying the forces which brought about this change, and that really was the theme of the book. 50 years before I did my field work, most Brahmins were landlords, and most landlords were Brahmins, and the Brahmin landlords also occupied the commanding heights in the power structure. But when I was doing my field work, much of the land was still owned by the Brahmins, but there were many Brahmins who had lost their land, and there were many more non-Brahmins by then who were landowners. But more important than that, there had come about a quite striking dissociation between caste and power. Power had shifted from the hands of the non-Brahmins, from the hands of the Brahmins, and the Brahmins, the non-Brahmins now controlled the institutions of power. So it was the correspondence was far less clear now, and apart from describing this growing dissociation, first between caste and land ownership, and then between caste and power, I was interested in identifying the forces which were bringing this about. This is really the argument of the book, or the subject of the book.
Looking back on the book, which was written some years ago now, are there any parts of it with which you're now particularly dissatisfied, or felt that you would have written it in a different way if you were doing it now? Or is it just finished?
Probably yes. I mean, there are many obvious deficiencies in the book. I mean, I ought to have presented far more data on the distribution of land than I did, and I ought to have collected far more data on that than I did, and probably I would have liked to do that. But I think in a way I'm glad that I finished with the book and moved on to other things, because if I dwelt too long with that kind of thing, I might not have moved into the areas over which I have sort of roamed the last 20 years or so. The book was published in '65, 21 years now, and I don't regret the fact that the book might have been much better if I'd spent another 5 years over it, because I did other things in those 5 years.
One of the things you moved on to, and which has been one of the central preoccupations of your academic life, is the theme of equality and inequality in human societies. I was wondering first, what do you think has made you so very interested in this area? It may be an obvious answer, but...
Well, I mean, there is a great deal of inequality in Indian society that one sees, and one tries to understand it living in that society. But I mean, I've always been struck by the fact that inequality is a very, very pervasive feature of all human societies. And you know, my childhood was spent in a colonial system, so I could see quite well that although Indians had lived with inequality for centuries and millennia, I mean, the Indians hadn't invented inequality. The colonial system, the imperial system, was a highly unequal system. So here was a problem which could be studied from many points of view. It was almost an inexhaustible problem. But I sort of, after doing my book on this one single village, I moved on to other things, and I took up caste, and I pursued that problem for another 3 or 4 years. But caste seen not just in the context of a single village, but in a larger context. And I published a series of papers which were then brought together as a book called Castes Old and New, which dealt first with the changing status aspects of caste and the changing relations between caste and politics. And so I did that, and then I moved on to the other dimension which I had discussed in my monograph, namely class. I spent a couple of years studying agrarian relations, relations between landowners, tenants, landless labourers, not just in a single village but in different parts of the country. And it was only after that that I moved on to more general studies of inequality.
if that's the chronological order, then perhaps we should deal with the question of caste next. Did you find the work of Srinivas on Sanskritization and on the mobility within the caste system helpful in your work?
Yes, it was very helpful, but I think that it was very limited also. I think one of what I consider to be one of my most important papers was an early essay on the backward classes, that is the untouchables, tribals and the other backward classes. It was written for a particular collection of studies which were projections of what things might be like 20 years or 25 years hence, and it was called The Future of the Backward Classes, the Competing Demands of Status and Power. And I found that what was wrong with the ideas of Sanskritization is that the inferior castes were now, particularly after independence, concerned not simply with improving their status, with imitating their superiors and improving their status in that way, but they were also concerned with engaging in political contest with them, in mobilizing political support on the basis of caste identities. And if they were doing that, then it might become important to assert their inferior status rather than to try to leave it behind. I mean, the kind of situation that you find with regard to blacks in the United States. I mean, blacks try to pass. There's a whole history of attempts by blacks to pass, which one might compare with Sanskritization. Then the political system acquires a certain character which encourages blacks to turn around and assert their deprived or disprivileged status in order to make political gains. So I think that Sanskritization was important, but there are other forces which act against Sanskritization, and I felt that Srinivas hadn't looked sufficiently deeply at these.
You talked about projecting into the future. Have you any thoughts on the future of the caste system? It's a very large question, but I know you've been thinking about this recently. Whether it's going to develop, as you suggested a little there, into a system of political groupings based on supposed ethnic identities and castes, or whether it's going to disappear as was once hoped, or whether it'll remain or change.
I don't think it's going to disappear. I think that, shortly after independence, Indians who had hoped a great deal from economic planning and parliamentary system and that kind of thing, and scientific education, perhaps thought that caste might disappear in a generation or two. I don't think that is going to happen at all. But I don't think that it's going to remain what it has been. It's changing in many important ways. It's changing, but I think that caste identities will continue to be a feature of Indian social structure for a very long time.
Caste is obviously very closely related to Hinduism. A rather technical question, but I wonder whether you would accept an account of Hinduism as a Durkheimian status-confirming religion, grown to a sort of world sociological religion. In other words, that caste is merely a reflection of a religious system and has nothing in itself. It's a system of ideas. Well,
no, I don't think I would agree with that. Although I see that the religious basis of caste played a very important part in keeping it in business for 2,000 years. But I can easily see these collective identities outliving the religious beliefs and values by which they were sustained. I can quite easily see inferior castes asserting their collective identities as inferior castes in the interest of securing greater political and other material advantages without necessarily subscribing to the orthodox Hindu theory of purity and pollution.
So even without Hinduism, if Hinduism faded, caste could continue?
In principle, yes, but I don't see either Hinduism or caste fading away. Therefore, it's not a it's a question to which I can't apply my mind very easily. Really,
yes. You continued on this theme and moved on to questions of equality and inequality, and you've often reflected on whether man is basically born equal or born unequal, questions which one traces back to, obviously, to Aristotle and more recently to Rousseau. Can you give a quick answer to the question of whether you think man is essentially born equal or unequal?
Well, I don't put that question in that form. I mean, what I would say is that the conditions of collective life are such that it is inconceivable without at least two forms of inequality. The conditions of collective life require, first of all, a certain system of values and scales of evaluation which generate inequalities of status. The conditions of collective life further require a certain kind of organization of activities, coordination and organization of activities which generate inequalities of power. So that I would rather say that, I find it very difficult to conceive of human societies without any inequality at all, because I find it very difficult to conceive of human societies which are not governed by some values on which people agree, and values which rank persons, beings, things, objects on scales, and you have inequality as a consequence of that. And I find it difficult to conceive of human societies which are not organized, at least minimally organized, with some inequalities in the distribution of power, some kind of chain of command and obedience. I find it very difficult to conceive of societies otherwise.
Would you accept, those are your own views, but would you accept that societies, if one reifies them that way, do have a general view of themselves and a premise about whether man is basically born equal or unequal, and that this is one of the things that differentiates basically modern industrial individualistic Western societies from societies like India, the premise of equality in the West and the premise of inequality in India?
Oh, I think that societies differ very much in what they consider to be the proper basis of collective life, and there have been societies in the past which have considered hierarchy as a part of the natural scheme of things, and from that point of view they're very different from modern societies which seek to build up collective life on the premise of equality. So they are very different from each other. But I would just say that, I know that there'd be sharp disagreement on this. I would say really that the basic difference there is not so much between India and the West as between the past and the present. I think that Indian society today, in many important ways, views itself or views its own ideal as being a society which is based on the premise of equality.
And the past would be, for India, when would be the turning point?
Yeah, the past was much longer in the case, very much longer in the case of India than in the case of the West, certainly. The 19th century, I would say. 19th century was the turning point.
And in the West? I know you claim to be a historian.
Certainly, certainly, it's well on its way by the time the Industrial Revolution comes, and the West is not one undifferentiated unit, certainly, and but even this image is all very well. I find that even in the United States today, which is probably a society which has gone further than other Western industrial societies in its faith in equality, the American creed, so-called. I think that people would argue that some inequalities are not only necessary but perhaps also desirable. I think the most striking thing about the attitude of contemporary societies to equality is that it is an ambivalent attitude. these societies very strongly want equality of opportunity, but I'm not quite sure that they want equally strongly equality of outcome, equality of result, or equal distribution of benefits. So these societies are very strongly achievement oriented, and if you place a very high value on individual achievement, what does it mean? It simply means that some individuals achieve more than others, even though you insist that the conditions of their competition should be equalized.
Do you think a real belief in an afterlife which differentiates between the sinners and the saved helps to overcome the observed inequalities in this life?
Yes, I think so.
And the absence of this general belief in Christianity, for example, means that the injustice, apparent injustice of the inequalities as observed around you, if you have the premise of equality, means that there's a psychic or psychological burden for people to understand how this could be.
Yes, indeed. And that is why the inequalities in modern societies are inherently unstable. They're inherently unstable because you have to correct them here and now. There is no other life in which they can be corrected. Yes, certainly. I mean, I remember there's one of my favorite arguments in this is an observation made in one of Dostoevsky's novels. This is The Brothers Karamazov, in which Ivan says, if there is no immortality, there is no virtue. And I think that is very important.
And Hinduism overcomes this problem, presumably, because there is offences here may not appear to be punished here, but
right,
there'll be some evening out in the end.
Yeah, but this is the point that I'd like to stress. Hinduism may overcome this problem. I cannot really say I'm not a Hindu. Hinduism may overcome this problem, but Hindus don't seem to be able to overcome it in the modern world.
The person who, with whom many of us have grown up in discussing these sorts of general problems is Louis Dumont, and I know that you've worked with him and battled with his ghost, as we all have. Perhaps you could just summarize what you think his main argument is and then comment on it.
Well, I mean, let me say that I found myself embattled with two kinds of theories. One is the sort of materialist interpretation of history. Marxism may not be a very great force in social anthropology, but it is an important intellectual force in India, and I found myself embattled with Marxism, a kind of Marxism which seeks to explain everything in terms of the economic base or the material structure of society, and to provide a complete explanation of social life and of history in terms of material forces. And I have found myself embattled equally strongly against the opposite tendencies, which seeks to explain everything in terms of ideas, beliefs, and values. So when you say that I have been embattled with Dumont, I would agree with that. But I would like to add that I find either kind of extreme position very difficult to accept. I think that let me say what I consider to be unsatisfactory in Dumont's work. And the first thing is that it is a definition of the sociology of India as being the sociology of Hinduism. I don't think that's a correct definition of the problem of understanding Indian society. Hinduism is a very important part of Indian society, including contemporary Indian society, but it's not the whole of Indian society, not the whole of contemporary Indian society. I think it pays far too little attention to economic and political forces operating in contemporary India.
So that would be the Andre, were there any other reasons why you felt that Dumont's work on India and caste was unsatisfactory?
Well, yes, there's a second reason which I think is closely related to the first, and probably it's a different way of stating the same criticism. I think that for Dumont, a preoccupation with ideas is what stands out as the defining feature of his work, and it's as if the sociology of ideas were the whole of sociology. I think he pays very little attention to a sociology of interests, and for me a more adequate picture of Indian society would be one which incorporated a sociology of interests along with a sociology of ideas. I think I find Dumont's position too idealistic, just as I find the position of my Marxist friends too materialistic. I think it's the interaction between ideas and interests which for me constitutes the essence of sociology.
You're swiping out in both directions, to your left and to your right, and you mentioned to your right with Dumont. To your left, have you anything further to say on the Marxist, why you find Marxist interpretation of Indian society unsatisfactory?
Well, I mean, Marxism, of course, is a far bigger thing than Louis Dumont. I mean, it's a whole enterprise, it's a whole intellectual and political enterprise. And I think that Marxism engages me to a far greater extent than just the work of Louis Dumont, because first of all, you have a much wider range of intellectual expressions of Marxism. Marxism would include, on the one hand, Lenin and Bukharin, and on the other hand, Gramsci, Lukács, and the whole range of writers whose views on ideas, on societies, on class would be very different from each other. And secondly, I think that Marxism is very important, not just in the battle of ideas, it's very important in politics, in the struggle for power. And yes, I mean, what I find unsatisfactory about Marxism is that it's very holistic. I mean, it claims too much for a particular point of view and a particular approach, which is exactly why I find Dumont's kind of idealism unsatisfactory.
You use the word holistic there. Are you using it in the same sense as the distinction that Dumont makes between holistic and individualistic societies? Because really this is to ask you whether you feel that distinction, rather than the hierarchical and non-hierarchical distinction that he made, is any more helpful in understanding differences.
No, I think I'm using the word holistic in a rather loose sense. Let me explain the sense in which I'm using it. I mean, I remember reading something by Bertrand Russell when I was an undergraduate, which has stuck very much in my mind. I think at some point he says that academic philosophers, since the time of Parmenides, have believed that the world is unity. It is my most fundamental belief that this is absolute nonsense. I think it's this point of view that you have a unified theoretical system, whether based on the materialist interpretation of history or the primacy of ideas. It's this that I find very difficult to accept as a sociologist. If I'd been a theologian, of course, I would have reveled in that kind of thing. But I think that sociology is very different from theology.
It comes back to Srinivas and the world not being too tidy.
Absolutely, precisely.
But reverting to holism and individualism in a different sense, do you find the contrast Dumont makes between Western, or as you might put it, modern societies which are individualistic, and traditional, or as it might be, Eastern societies which are holistic, helpful in?
Yes, certainly, but depends on how far you push that distinction. Depends on whether you have an open attitude towards the contrast, or take a dogmatic view of that contrast. Certainly, I'd agree that that collective identities play a far more important part in some societies than in others. I think, I mean, Nehru, who was India's first prime minister, and also was a very remarkable writer. Put it somewhere in one of his books about Indian society. He says that in this society, it's the family, the caste, and the village that counts for everything. The individual counts for nothing. I mean, this is the same idea really that Dumont is putting forward, and I think that there's something to it. But I don't think that one should push it too far, because I think that even in modern societies, collective identities have shown a remarkable durability. Take the United States, for instance, the black identity, the Jewish identity, ethnic identities of various kinds. Take the case of Netherlands, for instance, which is a country in which, after all, if individualism developed anywhere, I mean, Netherlands would be a very, very good example, but collective identities have shown remarkable persistence in the Netherlands. So I would, but by saying this, I don't mean to say that there's no case for making a contrast between modern societies, which assign far more importance to the individual, and all other societies, because modern societies also have collective identities and other societies also assign some importance to the individual. I think that there is a genuine contrast, but one must be careful not to push it too far.
Dumont, just to revert to him for the last time, has obviously had a great influence on studies in India. After his work, what do you think is the most important general questions on the agenda for work in India?
Well, I think that Dumont's work, I mean, let me make this very clear. I think that Dumont's work has been very important, and I think that it's a remarkable achievement. But I think that I'm uncomfortable with the almost exclusive emphasis that Dumont assigns to ideas. I think that I would like to see a greater emphasis assigned to material factors in the understanding of Indian society. I'd put it like this, that if I were to draw up an agenda for Indian sociology, I would put at the center of that agenda the study of institutions, the study of organizations, the study of social action, rather than the study of ideas. And I think that there's a great deal to be done in that direction. And I think that in one way or another, the sociology of Dumont has shifted attention away from the field view of Indian society to the book view of Indian society. And I think that the time has now come for the balance to be redressed. I mean, I don't think that the book view, that we can ever afford to dispense with the book view of Indian society, no matter how greatly enthused we may be about field work. But I think that one has gone too far in the direction of the book view.
I wanted to ask you, Andre, one or two questions which now place India in comparison to some of the other major world religions and civilizations, and starting with Islam. India, or Hinduism particularly, is based on the oppositions of purity and a hierarchical model, whereas Islam to a certain extent is based on honor and violent conflict. Do you have any explanations why you have this difference?
No, but I'm as a sociologist, I'm less interested in trying to work out the sources of these distinctions than in their implications. What consequences does this distinction have for society, or for economy, or for politics? And I think that is something on which one might say a great deal. I mean, the contrast between Islam and Hinduism has often been made in terms of the contrast between equality and hierarchy, and I think that that's valid up to a point. There's no doubt about that. But once again, I think that one mustn't push too far the commitment to equality in actually existing Islamic societies, because, I mean, we have lived with an Islamic society for several hundred years, and the court culture built up in the city in which I now live by the Mughals was certainly not an egalitarian culture in any sense of the term. It was a very hierarchical culture. But nevertheless, there is that difference between Islam and Hinduism. But I think that from the point of view of the contemporary world and contemporary politics, I think there's another difference which is very important. I think that Hinduism has been, in some sense, a genuinely pluralistic religion, which has not only tolerated, but in some sense encouraged diverse ways of life, diverse beliefs, diverse practices. And Islam has a deep core of fundamentalism in it. And I made a contrast earlier between theology and sociology. I think from that point of view, I would say that Islam is more conducive to theology and less conducive to sociology. Whereas I think that there's something to be said about the Hindu intellectual tradition being more in tune with what I would regard as a proper sociological perspective. And I say this, I'd like to assert this, I say this not as a Hindu because I'm not a Hindu myself, but I think that there is something very important in the Indian intellectual tradition there.
Another contrast one might make between two great civilizations is between India and China. It's difficult at a point in time to make this, but given a roughly similar geographical base and to a certain extent similar environmental conditions, are there any easy answers to the question of why India it seems so politically fragmented, whereas China has a certain degree of integration, at least at present? Do you think this is a long-term trend, or is it a...
It probably is a long-term trend. I mean, that's one contrast, that China has been far more successful in managing its polity, so to say, than India. An administrative structure, a state apparatus, and so on. But there is another contrast, and I wonder whether the two contrasts are related to each other. India has generated a very large number of religions. I mean, if you look at India has been a cradle of so many major Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so on and so forth. And China has produced very little of that. And I wonder whether India's weakness in generating a stable, coherent political order may not be linked with the proliferation of religious ideas, religious doctrines, religious views, and the opposite kind of correlation in China. But I mean, these are just very speculative suggestions. I would.
Sounds like the remark about Switzerland, which is so efficient and organised and coherent and integrated and so on, and then it always ends with, well, what has Switzerland produced? The cuckoo clock. The last contrast I was going to ask you to make, many people may have read Niraj Chaudhury's works, and particularly his reflections on the differences between England and India, and his passage to England and so on. As an Indian from Delhi coming to Europe, what are your main, what gives you the most surprise when you come here in terms of what you find as a culture in Europe, looking as an anthropologist from the outside?
Well, I mean, these are, there are many surprises, but I would describe these as situational surprises rather than structural surprises, in the sense that I don't know how many lessons I would draw from these surprises, because you mustn't forget that England or Western Europe, and especially England, has been a part of the sensibility of modern educated Indian to a far greater extent than the opposite. And so, I mean, I wouldn't expect any major surprises, but of course there are differences and contrasts. I mean, I think that the contrast, the most striking contrast, would be in the sphere of work and occupational roles, and the commitment to these occupational roles and to work in general, which is far better established throughout Western Europe than in India or in any South Asian country. And conversely, the commitment to family, kinship, community is far more extensive in countries like India, in that kind of society. But apart from that, it would have to be very specific kinds of contrasts. One would have to consider the fact that India is a highly differentiated society, highly stratified society, and so on. Yes.
Most recently, some of your work has been devoted to the question of the future of the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, and I wondered particularly in relation to the scheduled tribes, what you foresee the future of remaining tribal groups in India.
I think that these groups will remain, will retain their distinctive identities at least for another 2 or 3 generations, and it's very difficult for a sociologist to make any predictions beyond that. I just don't see them losing their distinctive identities, certainly not their language, certainly not their major social customs, although more and more individual members of these tribal communities will become community free, in the sense that they will become incorporated into the modern educational system, they will become incorporated into the modern occupational system, and increasingly there'll be areas of life in which their tribe or their community ceases to be relevant. But there will be other areas of life, for instance marriage, religious customs, in which they will continue to act as members of these particular tribes. But how rapidly this will happen and how extensively for the various tribes in the country is very difficult to predict. Much will depend on the pace of economic change, development of education and so on.
Could we turn now to one or two of the encounters you've had with people on your various visits to the West? Though perhaps to start with, are there any of your Indian colleagues you'd like to say anything more about? You mentioned Bose.
Yes. Well, yes, I think I would, because he was for 2 reasons I'd like to say something about him. Firstly, because he was in every respect a very remarkable person, and secondly, because his work is so little known outside India. He was a remarkable person because he did outstanding work as an anthropologist, but he was much more than an anthropologist. He belonged to that generation of Indian intellectuals who were actively involved in the nationalist movement, and he had a tremendous range of interests. And in fact, he published a book in the 1940s, a book which was published in Bengali, and which I translated and published in English in the 1970s, called The Structure of Hindu Society. And that book, in fact, foreshadows many of the basic arguments that you find in the work of Dumont and Pocock. And the book really is in 3 parts. The argument, he was a great fieldwork. He traveled throughout the country, lived with tribal people, studied fairs and pilgrim centers and all the rest of it. And he showed that you could construct a certain picture of India, particularly its tribal people, on the basis of ethnographic observation and description. And he showed that you could also construct a certain picture of Indian society, particularly its tribal people, on the basis of Indological studies, a study of classical texts. And he showed the congruence between these 2 pictures, the idea that you get of Indian society by doing anthropological fieldwork, and the idea that you get of Indian society by looking at the classical texts, in fact confirm each other. They confirm a picture of a particular kind of social structure. But then he went on to argue that that social structure was being dislocated from the middle of the 19th century onwards, as India became involved more and more in a world economic system, in larger political conflicts, and so on and so forth. So he was, I think, a very remarkable person and has had a very, very great influence on me.
Andre, what would you think were the main contrasts in temperament and personality and academic style between Bose and Srinivas?
Srinivas was a very mild-mannered and a very charming person, very relaxed, sort of person who immediately put you at your ease. He wasn't a very powerful speaker. Bose gave the immediate impression of a magnetic personality, someone who held your attention immediately. and Bose was in his element in an argument, in a debate. Srinivas was a much more persuasive person. I mean, he would try to persuade you. I mean, he would not try to impose an argument or a conclusion on you. And Bose had in that sense arguments and conclusions which he felt ought to be categorically asserted. He was a very categorical person, although very rich mind and a very exciting person intellectually. And Bose was a nationalist in a sense in which Srinivas was not. Bose had been actively concerned with the national movement, and he believed that Indians ought to be more self-reliant in building up an apparatus for the study of their own society. He believed that there was a very rich intellectual tradition in India, and you needed to tap that. Mind you, I mean, he was not an obscurantist in any sense, but he felt very passionately about building up sociology in India through the effort of Indian intellectuals. I mean, Srinivas was much more relaxed about that kind of thing. He had Bose was trained entirely in India. He'd never been abroad till he was in his late 50s, whereas Srinivas had been in Oxford. He'd been trained by Radcliffe Brown and Evans Pritchard, and he was much more cosmopolitan. Srinivas was a much more cosmopolitan person in that sense.
You have met and encountered very many of the European and American anthropologists in your various visits to the West and when they visited India. I wondered particularly the people who influenced you or you got to know well. Among them might be, for example, Max Gluckman in Manchester. Could you say anything about?
Yes. Well, I mean, let me say very quickly, very briefly mention people who have influenced me most among British anthropologists, although I didn't have any very close personal relationship with them. I think the person who has influenced me most would be Evans Pritchard, although I met him once very briefly. But he influenced me through his writings and also through the influence he had on M.N. Srinivas, who was very closely associated with him, and through the influence he had on various other people, including Max Gluckman. I knew Max Gluckman. I knew him fairly closely and well, and greatly admired his work, and greatly appreciated his his personal interest in me. He invited me over to Manchester the year after I'd finished my PhD. He invited me over to spend a year at Manchester as a Simon Fellow, and I benefited very greatly by my contact with him. And it was in that year that I first made the acquaintance of Edmund Leach, and I would say that of that generation of anthropologists, these are the two people I got to know most closely, and these are the two people with whom I have interacted most closely. And in some ways they're very, very unlike each other. There's a chapter in Adam Cooper's book on British anthropology devoted to these two, and it's called The Mavericks. And I think that's very unfortunate, because Max Gluckman was in no sense a maverick. He took his anthropology terribly seriously. He was very earnest about his anthropology. He was not a very tactful person always, but he was a very charismatic person, and he took his anthropology very seriously. I don't think that I would say that of Edmund Leach, although I think that in his own way he's also been a tremendous intellectual force in British anthropology.
What would you think that Gluckman's main contribution to anthropology, what your own work has been, his intellectual contribution?
I think in the same line as Srinivas. I think that my way of looking at human societies is that you have to consider ideas, beliefs and values. They are very important, and they are autonomous up to a point. But you also have to consider interests and the conflict of interests, and they too are autonomous up to a point. And what is really important in the study of any society is the interaction between ideas, beliefs and values on the one side and material interests on the other side. And I think that there was Gluckman's work was animated by this concern for the interplay between the two, and I think that I got a great deal out of that. I mean, Gluckman wrote a textbook of anthropology which he calls Politics, Law and Ritual in Tribal Societies, and I think that that's my idea of what social anthropology and sociology ought to be about, rather than working out the coherence of idea systems in themselves. And Gluckman had a tremendous interest in fieldwork, in seeing how societies actually functioned, and he developed this method of extended case studies, and there was a whole lot of people there working in Manchester. There was John Barnes, whom I met in Manchester. John Barnes was in fact the first Simon Fellow in Manchester. Then there was Clyde Mitchell, who had also been a Simon Fellow in Manchester, and John Barnes had developed this idea about social networks, as you know, and I wrote a paper on which I published along with M. Srinivas. In fact, it was a paper jointly published in Man on social networks, and I think that again, Gluckman conveyed this sense of the complexity and the richness of human societies, which are far more complex and rich than any theory can adequately represent.
He was known not to be always on the best of terms, putting it as an English understatement, with Sir Edmund Leach. And so obviously there was a certain delicacy in the fact that you became friends of both of them. But were there, turning to Leach, in what ways do you feel he influenced your work, and do you admire his work?
Yes, I greatly admire his work. But Leach, Gluckman was, as I said, very earnest about his anthropology, and he used to go, and every Saturday he used to go with the whole department to see the football match, and he was very earnest about that as well. Whereas Edmund Leach has always struck me as being very irreverent, very irreverent. I remember very vividly my first encounter with Edmund Leach. I knew a great deal about the folklore of British anthropology, and I was very young then. He had invited me to lunch, and he used to share rooms in King's. This was before he became Provost of King's, and he had asked me over, and I came about half an hour before lunch, and he offered me a sherry. And I drank the sherry, and I was a bit awkward and stiff. So he offered me another glass of sherry and said, "Oh, come on, have another." And I was hesitant, and he said, come on, have it." And then after that he offered me a third glass, and I was really very hesitant, and he laughed and said, "Oh, come on, have it. Don't worry. It's very good sherry, and besides, it's Meyer's sherry, not mine." And I think that sort of was so characteristic of Edmund. But apart from that, as an anthropologist, I think he had tremendous force and vitality. When I started teaching in the University of Delhi, I was 23 or 24 years old, and Srinivas gave me the syllabus and said that I would have to teach the course in political sociology. And so I had to read all those books, because my training in Calcutta had been rather different from that. And there were, I think, half a dozen books which had to be explained very thoroughly to the students, and which I had to read. And some of those I hadn't read before. And one of them was Political Systems of Highland Burma. And I think it is an absolutely superb book, which is one of the classics of modern anthropology.
Edmund obviously had a great influence both in that book and in his latest work, and his short-term or medium-term conversion to French structuralism. Can you assess his general contribution to the anthropology of the second half of this century, or British anthropology? Do you think, is it now possible to place him in any way?
Yes, I think he shook British anthropology out of its complacency. I think there was a period in the development of anthropology when British anthropology was not only very strong and very successful, but also somewhat complacent. And I think Edmund Leach played a very important part in shaking this all up. But I think I think what strikes me most about Edmund Leach is that although he was such a powerful intellectual figure, I think I'm right in saying that he studiously avoided the role of a guru. I think he was not interested in building up an intellectual school which he would then have to defend. And I said that for me anthropology means equal attention to ideas and interests. And you see this in Edmund Leach's work, although in a very different way from the way in which you see it in Gluckman's work or in Evans Pritchard's work. You see it in Edmund Leach's work because, I mean, how does he define structure in the political systems of Highland Burma? It's basically a system of ideas. But then you see Pulelia swings almost to the opposite extreme. And I think the interesting thing about Leach is that he's never afraid to ask really important questions. And when he doesn't find an answer to them, I think he admits that he hasn't found the answer. And I think that's a remarkable quality.
He obviously did manage to find sherry, though, even if it belonged to Meyer Fortes. As another person who you must have got to know and been influenced by was Meyer Fortes. What sort of man was he, and how did you assess him?
Well, I came to know Meyer Fortes rather late. I mean, I knew his work, of course. I mean, we had to teach all that because in the first 10 years in the Department of Sociology at Delhi University, Srinivas was the dominant figure. And Srinivas had soaked up all this in his Oxford days, and for Srinivas, sociology meant Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, Meyer Fortes. So I knew his work, but I didn't know him personally at all well until I came to Cambridge in 78, 79, the year I spent there, and I got to know him. What struck me most about Meyer Fortes is that he was a craftsman. He was really a craftsman who was prepared to go on for years on end, hammering out the little bits and pieces and trying to put them into place. And I think that's very, very impressive. As you know, I mean, he's written this autobiographical piece in which he divides anthropologists into pontiffs and journeymen. And I think that's very impressive, really, the way in which he describes his own vocation. And I think he lived up to it. And I think that's really extremely impressive.
Turning to, finally, to one or two more general questions again. You've talked often interchangeably about sociology and anthropology, and you are a professor of sociology, and though you are known as an anthropologist as well. Do you see any opposition between these two disciplines, or differences between them, or?
Well, yes and no. You know, I mean, when I first started teaching sociology in the University of Delhi, it was a big department, it was an important department, but we had to face criticism from our colleagues in other departments of sociology who were saying that what we were doing was not sociology at all, but anthropology. And I argued in my lectures and in my writings for the unity of sociology and social anthropology. I argued that sociology and social anthropology were basically two different names for the same intellectual enterprise, which is comparative sociology. And I think that I would still stand by that argument, provided you defined anthropology as social anthropology in the way in which it was done by Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, Fortes, Gluckman. But you know, anthropology itself has changed a great deal. When I started my career in the late 50s, Radcliffe Brown was a very important influence in anthropology. Anthropology, you know, he was a very, very important figure in anthropology. But in the 1980s, perhaps the most important figure in anthropology is Levi-Strauss. And if I define anthropology as what Levi-Strauss does, then I'm less confident about the unity of anthropology and sociology. Because Levi-Strauss himself has taken great pains in many of his writings to distinguish between the two. After all, what is anthropology? Anthropology is le regard éloigné, the view from afar. I mean, I can't honestly say when I'm studying Indian society that I'm taking a view from afar. So if that is what anthropology is, then I'm not an anthropologist when I'm studying Indian society. But I hope that's not the last word about anthropology.
I hope not. Could I ask you just to come back to a topic we briefly discussed, which is the question of nationalism, and specifically the integration of the very many small groups in Indian society, the tribes and the castes, and their use of their identities. Do you see the future of India as a building contradiction between the centre and the periphery, and these small subgroups which will more and more assert their separate identities, or do you think there is some possibility of a melting pot and unification?
Well, it needn't be a melting pot. I mean, you can have integration without these identities being dissolved. I mean, you can have a pluralist political system in which these identities remain and within a larger national whole. I would rather say that there are tensions rather than contradictions. Tensions certainly there are. Indians themselves are very greatly preoccupied with what they describe as the problem of national integration, how to hold the nation together, and the threat of sub-nationalism has been a very important preoccupation with Indians. And rather than tribes and castes, I would say that the main threats to national integration are the identities which arise out of language and religion. I mean, tribe and caste are there, but regional identities which are mixed up with linguistic identities, they are an important threat to national integration. There's a form of sub-nationalism which threatens the larger national whole. Religious identity is also, I mean, the country was once divided on the basis of religious identities. And sometimes when the linguistic identity and the religious identity converge, then of course the threat becomes very large, as in the case of the Sikhs in the Punjab today. So that is certainly there. But whether the country will hold together or break apart, I really don't know. All I can say is that I very much hope that it will hold together. There's no reason why it should not, really.
Finally, Andre, although you're in a series of interviews with many great men who have achieved your work, you are in fact in the middle of your work, and I was wondering what your own plans for the next year or two, and what what next, in a sense, in your own work, what you're most interested in pursuing in the next few years.
As you remember, I was here in Cambridge last year, almost exactly this time last year, to give the Smuts lectures, which were on the theme of positive discrimination and social justice. And there were 4 lectures, basically on the backward classes in India, their position in contemporary Indian society, and the problem of creating special opportunities for them without violating the general principle of equal opportunities for all. And this is something that I hope to pursue and perhaps write up as a bigger work on an important aspect of Indian society, the structure of Indian society.
Well, I think I would like to thank you very much indeed, Andre, for a fascinating insight into the problems of being a comparative sociologist, bridging many cultures, many traditions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to having another interview like this in about 10 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you.